Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome back. This is Lee McWhorter, cybersecurity instructor for WazU. Welcome back to the second workshop on the cryptography and access management class that began last week. Last week we covered mainly the sort of historical parts of the cryptography lessons. The first three, intro to cryptography concepts, all about what cryptography is about, how we turn clear text into ciphertext, the different means, introduction to the Caesar cipher, one of the more major initial historical ones. Then lesson two was a kind of a history run through a whole bunch of different types of ciphers, symmetrical ciphers, and then some discussion as well as we moved into lesson three into the states of data, and something we'll return to again. And so we actually, there's a dovetail in this class between the cryptography and the access management parts. Those two go together. So we kind of shift into a little bit of additional cryptography here in lesson four on wireless cryptography, and talking a little bit more about public key infrastructure, public-private keys, like we talked about last week. And then we move into a few lessons today that are more access control lessons. And then last week, next week, we will cover the last parts of the access control and actually revisit the encryption again in the PKI, public key infrastructure part. So that quick review aside and overview aside, like I said, we covered the first three lessons last week. So this week we got four to get through. And the first one we're going to talk about is lesson four. It's on wireless cryptography. And it's really an interesting time to be talking about wireless cryptography, because we are in the process in the world now where a new Wi-Fi standard is about to come out, or a set of Wi-Fi standards. The IEEE, or the IEEE organization, they are the ones who propagate the Wi-Fi standards. And so throughout the years, we've had 802.11 and then some kind of usually letter after that. So we started off with 802.11a as the first Wi-Fi standard. And over the years, we've had B, we've had G and N, and now more recently AC. And we are in the process, as a matter of fact, supposedly this fall, the newest Wi-Fi standard will be propagated out there by the Wi-Fi Alliance and the IEEE. And we are seeing that there's a number of things going on. One that is not part of the course because it's a new thing, but nonetheless, they have decided at that organizational level to change the naming nomenclature of Wi-Fi, even though we'll still have around things like 802.11b or AC or whatever. The reality is that they're looking at moving toward naming the Wi-Fi standards based on a number. And so the new Wi-Fi standard that's going to be coming out, and I believe in effect it's going to be like AX instead of AC. So that's its older name model, if I'm remembering correctly. But it's going to be called Wi-Fi 6. And so in effect, as you kind of back up, they've backdated all the old Wi-Fi standards. So you're going to begin to see more references to not only the new Wi-Fi 6 standard coming out, but also to potentially Wi-Fi 5, Wi-Fi 4, and what they're going to be talking about, if you see those references, is they are talking about those older Wi-Fi standards like AC and N as they go back in time. Now, the last couple standards that have been around, we've seen them operate on in a 2 megahertz, in a 5 gigahertz range, and a 4 gigahertz range. And one of the things that we're going to see in this newest Wi-Fi 6 is a continuing operation across both ranges. Still backwards compatibility, of course, but one of the big things that we've been seeing, and even a router I bought not too terribly long ago, already had some of this in some of the more recent standards. They're sort of rolling them all into one. But the idea that the base stations, the access points, have some smarts in them so that they can keep track of wherever all the devices are, and then instead of just sort of sending out a diffuse broader signal out, and thus it gets weak by the end of the range. If you have a device way on the end of the range, they can target that, they can focus that signal and put more energy, so it makes sure that we maintain a steady connection. So there's some things like this that are going to be part of the new standard. But in addition to just the new Wi-Fi standards and whether we get more bandwidth and throughput, and handling more devices at one time, which is sort of what Wi-Fi 6 is all about, is to move us to that world of the Internet of Things, where there are more and more devices on our networks, and of all different types, and we need to maintain steady connections to these devices, so that they can send back their data, or do whatever their role is. But the other piece of it that's going to happen is we're going to also be getting WPA3. And so when you look at the cryptography part, or you look at the security part of Wi-Fi, of course, Wi-Fi has historically been very poor. It seems like almost every time, and I'm hoping that's not, knock on wood, the case with the new Wi-Fi 6 and WPA3 that comes out later this year, and rolling into next year as companies begin to put more and more support into it. We're already seeing the first products from like Dell and Samsung say that they're Wi-Fi 6 ready. And so, we're going to see that rollout continue to happen as we move into the end of the year and into next year. But we've had over the years throughout while there's been the Wi-Fi standards of the protocol about how the data is carried and how much throughput and how many devices and all those specs that make up the A's, the B's, the N's, the AC's, the standards. We've also had some degree of security along the way, right? So we started off years and years ago with wireless equivalent protection, WEP, and then we have had things like even the wireless protected setup, which is used in some devices as a push button way to get devices onto a network. And then of course we've had WPA, and most recently WPA2. As I said, it seems that it doesn't take very long after one of these standards is propagated and is out there in the wild on various devices that various people figure out how to break those standards, or figure out ways to figure out keys, break into access points, etc. And so we have been in a situation where, especially the sort of small business home users have been in a situation where, without using some of the additional enterprise layers of security and authentication built in and supported by the WPA2 protocol at an enterprise level, most of us, with just home routers, small office routers, etc., have had pretty much the default standards. And so we've been in a pretty precarious world of those security standards have had breaches and have had known flaws and faults. And especially if you happen to have an older router that maybe is no longer updating, then you run the risk that your Wi-Fi access could be compromised. There's a lot of hope that the new standards will help in WP3, at least initially. Some of the reviews I've read of it are that it's going to definitely improve things. I haven't seen anybody yet, and I've been too busy, to be honest, this last summer to stay up as much as I usually do. But I haven't seen just the major somebody go, hey, already broke it. But there are no doubt already things being found within it, and once it goes live, we'll hope that it stays pretty secure for a while. Now, one of the other pieces, besides all of these letter and alphabet soup of the different wireless standards that's covered in Lesson 4, is actually a little bit of a discussion about public-private key, additional discussion. We've talked about that, how historically with symmetric keys, the problem was how do you exchange them? How could we do banking transactions and things like that over the internet if we didn't pre-share the keys? And so this whole model of public-private key that we use now kind of ubiquitously across the internet and across our day-to-day lives with technology, many times without even knowing about it. This, was created to get around that issue. And so the idea that each party generates a public and a private key, freely share the public keys, and then because of the way the math works, if I take your public key and use my private key to encrypt a message and send it to you, then you need the corresponding opposite pieces. You need your private key and you need my public key. And with those two things, you can decrypt that message, and ostensibly you're the only person who can decrypt that message. And so we can have that initial communication, even start an initial communication, having never met each other, having never used that e-commerce site before, having never used that bank before, the very first time, we can go through this process of negotiating and doing the math, if you will, and validating, the encryption method. And as I even mentioned last week, generally what happens is we use that asynchronous method, the public-private key method, to set up an initial secure channel over which a symmetric key is shared, so that then we can gain advantage of the efficiency and speed of processing symmetric encryption over asymmetric encryption. So in this chapter, and because it does fit into elements of the way all access controls and wireless access controls and others we'll talk about work, and definitely powers a lot of the systems out there, from logging into our bank and e-commerce sites to SSH servers and remote access to cloud instances and things like that. This model of public key, private key is an underpinning model of the modern commerce and modern technology. And so there's a really interesting exercise. It gets people sometimes a little bit if they're not fans of math, but I promise it's not super complex here. But the idea is you're introduced to a group of ostensibly famous fake people, particularly Alice and Bob, but also Evil Eve. And in these, you can actually Google Alice and Bob and find websites about them, and you're going to get a couple different exposures to Alice and Bob here. They are fictitious people that are used and have been used historically to discuss cryptography situations. And in this case, for example, Alice and Bob want to be able to somehow share a message with each other, but they don't want Eve to be able to eavesdrop over that and to break that communication. And so what you see in this exercise and what the lesson explains, and then you're going to calculate your own version of it. Like I said, not too complex. We're not talking linear algebra or regression analysis. This is pretty basic math. But the concept is, this is the way I like to describe it to students, is this exercise is sort of a proof of concept of how public key, private key works. Because as you work through the math of the lesson, and then you change the numbers and put different inputs into the equations, and you rework it as your exercise, you'll see that the math allows for people to get the same answer, basically. And of course, that's a mathematical proof of concept of how public-private key works. And it's kind of a cool concept. I think most students in the past have found it, very insightful to understand how that works. And so you're going to see your first visit with Alice and Bob in the lesson 4, and you will even do a part of your exercises involved with calculating one of these proof of concept exercises. So then we move into lesson 5, which is called access management concepts. Now, we've talked so far mainly about cryptography and how we encrypt text, how we turn plain text into ciphertext, and how we can have secret communications, at least ostensibly, right, depending on the protocol or algorithm in use. But this is also an access management course. And so, as I mentioned in the first week, these go together on purpose, because most of the time when we're doing things like logging into that bank, we're not sure there's that encryption going on. We want that. We want our passwords to be securely transferred and encrypted. We want our credit card information, our balances, our credit cards, our account numbers, all that stuff. We want to be secure. So we use cryptography to be able to secure that communication pathway. But what is going on actually in the very beginning of that transaction? We're logging in to our bank. We're logging into our Amazon account. We're logging into our corporate enterprise account. And so we're using this public-private key infrastructure as an access control method, or as an authentication method, right? And it's, for example, if you remember back in Network Foundations in second class of the program, long time ago now, you had to do an exercise where you built a virtual machine, you're running Ubuntu, you installed the OpenSSH server, and you were able to connect from your machine to that virtual computer remotely, but using exactly the same methodology that we would if, say, we spun up a virtual machine instance in the cloud, say on Amazon, and we would get a key so we could access. So we went further in the exercise. We initially could just log in with username and password, but then we learned how to create a set of public-private keys, how to put the public key up on the server. And so when we log in, the math of, those keys go together, the public and private, that can be validated, and that is the means of access control, right? And so there are a lot of different access control systems out there, lots of different ways that access and authentication, etc. work. But before we get into some of the specifics, we also need to look at sort of the concepts here, right? So what is going on in access? When you're letting somebody log into a website, you're letting somebody log into your enterprise network, you're letting somebody log into an accounting system. Well, there are really a series of steps that are going on that are part of access control. One of the first things that we have to do is we have to identify that user in some form or fashion, right? So if you take a classic login username password mechanism, when I go to a site and I basically put in and enter my username, I'm identifying myself. That's the identification part of the entire access and authentication ritual, so to speak. Then what we have to do is we have to authenticate that user. Okay, just because I typed in my username, user1, Ubuntu1, or whatever my strange corporate username might be, I then also have to provide another piece of information. I have to authenticate that I am that person. So that's where the password comes in, right? So with the password, I've entered now my username. That's provided my identity. I have provided a password. Assuming those match, then that's something, ideally, at least the way we understand that model, not counting hackers or guesses or bad passwords aside, if the username and the password match, then we have identified that user, and then we can authenticate that user based on the password matching the appropriate username. Now, that's still only a couple steps. So even at my bank or at my corporate network, I've identified myself and I've authenticated myself. So we know who I am. We validated who that identity is by the password. But then the last step of the entire access control process is authentication or authorization. Sure, authentication is the second step. So the third is authorization. So what rights do I have once I get that? So if I log in with user one and a password, I have established the identity of user one. The password has helped authenticate that that user is me, user one. And then within the system, say, most enterprise networks, once I've logged in, then the servers, know my user. I'm in certain groups. Maybe I'm in the accounting team. And so I can see certain shares on the network. I can see access to certain information, but obviously other things I can't. Some other user logs in that's a IT admin. They log in with admin one, and so that's their identity. They provide their password and authorize themselves or authenticate themselves, and then the system validates their authentication and what authorizations they have. And so in principle, regardless of the type of system out there, those are the conceptual steps that you're going through when you log into a service. And so one of the things that, of course, like with public-private key encryption and using things like SSH, we can protect the stream of communication going back and forth across the endpoints and across the network. And we can just use SSH in that capacity to encrypt it and still use our username and password model. But we can go further, as we did in Network Foundations, and we can even use the keys as ways to not only be part of the encryption exchange, but actually to be part of the authentication. Because when you create a public and private key pair, they are intimately tied mathematically. And so they are a set. And so while we can take part of that, the public key, and share it widely with the world, put it on a key server, give it to our colleagues and friends, we have to keep that private key part very privately stored on our machine because it's intimately involved with that. If somebody uses your public key to encrypt a message, it's your private key that's going to be a big part of being able to decrypt it, right? And so there are, of course, all kinds of levels of access once you have authenticated yourself onto a network. What authorized level are you going to be at? Obviously, the highest levels are generally our admins, right? And that doesn't just have to be IT or security admins. Many enterprise software packages, say the accounting department, again, it's always a great example. They have lots of software, accounting software, billing software, invoicing stuff, and sometimes all integrated in a package. And then even within that system alone, there may be rights. There might be the head of accounting that when they log into the accounting software, they have access to everything. They're basically an admin. But, when somebody in the accounts payable department logs in, they only get access to that part of the billing and accounting system. And so you have these situations, and that's, what's going on with the authentication. We're trying to establish that entity and prove who they are so we can figure out what level of access that they're going to get, or the systems can figure out what level of access they're going to get. So we have of course admin level of access, we have read write author level of access, we have just read only. I remember once again using the accounting example, but we had a state auditor come in a company I worked at years ago, And we already had layers of security, a couple senior people, myself included, had pretty much full access to the accounting system. Our accounts payable people had access to that. Our accounts receivable people had access to that. And then we had a state auditor come in, and they needed to be able to see everything to audit. But we didn't want to create, any chance that even accidentally they could hit a key and cause a problem. So we created a high-level read-only account for that auditor. And it was a one-off account. We created that username and password for that auditor who spent a week on site going through our books and doing their state audit. And because our books were in order, we were able to provide them that kind of an access. They could look in the system fully and read anything, but they were only in read-only mode, so there was not even a chance of an accidental deletion. And of course, you can ultimately have no writes on a network, right? There are a number of other concepts that are tied into all this, and some of them are some at least repeat concepts, but there's a kind of a hodgepodge of things at the end of this lesson on corporate security policy and how they play into this, how corporate policy plays into this, acceptable use policy of the network is going to play into, what rights and accesses you have. And even all the way to other concepts, including how this fits into disaster recovery and business contingency planning, etc. And so, mainly concepts, a little bit of review of at least some of those peripheral corporate policy and other concepts, but some introductory thing. And probably one of the biggest things is the whole process actually there. That idea that authentication, that access controls or access management is all really about kind of a three-step process. We identify the user, we authenticate that user, and then we provide authorization or access to that user. So as we move on, so let's see, so 4 was wireless cryptography, 5 was these access management concepts. And then in lesson 6, we revisit a concept that we talked about all the way back in the first class, and that's the concept of risk management. We go a little deeper into it, and you might ask, okay, why is this all of a sudden thrown right in here? Well, because as we've said before, in the biggest picture, almost everything we do in cybersecurity is an exercise in risk management. We have to, all the way back to, if you remember, it's one of my standard examples in the first class, if 2 different companies both have a website and they look at their situation, and one of them, is a restaurant and has their menu up and they get a few new customers a day, and one of them is Amazon who makes gazillions of dollars every second, they both have a website. They both face the same risk of a web attacker attacking their website, but the outcome, the impact is going to be so much bigger on Amazon that obviously Amazon is going to spend umpteen dollars and put all kinds of people and resources on protecting their system. Whereas the little restaurant here might do nothing more than keep a backup of their website on a USB stick, so if somebody breaks in and messes it up, they can delete it and reinstall, and they're back up and running in no time. That may be all they do. Well, what is it? How is it that that company decides to only do that and Amazon decides to spend millions of dollars? It's risk management. They each look at the risk they face. They go through the risk assessment and figure out, what are the likely possible risk? How likely are they? And then what are the impacts, right? We do that thing called business impact analysis. But when you get down to it, when we do risk management, what we're trying to do is calculate the probabilities of something happening to us, right? And risk is actually the probability of something times its impact. So if you have, and remember, even going back to security foundations, we talked about that there are 2 types of risk assessments that one can do. One is the quantitative risk assessment, and one is the qualitative risk assessment. The qualitative one is the more subjective. Okay, we think the risk of a web hack is low, medium, or high. We think the impact of that is, mild, impactful, severe, whatever our categories are. If we end up going through a risk management, risk assessment process, and those are the classifications, if those are how we're looking at our risk, if those are how we define those risks as low, medium, and high, and the impacts as low, medium, high, then we're doing a qualitative analysis. And that's better than nothing. If you, even in the shortest term, looking at one system, looking at a new policy, trying to do the whole overall corporate policy, if nothing else, do at least a qualitative risk assessment. If you're trying to decide, in our concept here, you're trying to decide where, to give what level of rights within our system do I give Well, we can obviously use our least privilege principle, and we should as a guiding principle. But we have to then, still, okay, and this is a gray area. Do I really give that people that access, this type of people, this level of employee? Who do I give? So you, and nothing else, kind of have to do a little qualitative. Well, if I give them access, there's a slight chance they could delete things, and there's a risk there. So how big of a risk is it worth, for me to give that access or not? In a sense, even if we just go through that little mental exercise qualitatively, that's what we're doing with risk assessment and helping us make decisions in cybersecurity. Do we grant that access? Do we run that service? Do we offer that technology? Do we have, those protections on our network, etc. And then, of course, ideally, though, and in many cases in corporate environments, what you're going to see is not a qualitative, kind of gut category-based, subjective type of analysis. Instead, you're going to have a quantitative analysis where you're going to do some math. You're going to estimate the impacts of things, not just, oh, I think it's going to be a high impact, or wow, that would be really bad for us, kind of qualitative. We're going to say, oh, the impact is $70,000 a second or an hour or a day or whatever the case is. So if we're an e-commerce site and the e-commerce site goes down, we can calculate some costs. We can calculate, accounting department can tell us how much money we make per hour. And so if our website's down an hour and we make $200,000 an hour, then obviously that's bad, right? And so we would be willing to spend a fair amount of money, up to, we don't really want to spend, we probably aren't going to spend 200 million to stop an hour of downtime if all that would cost us is 200,000. But you see my point. That's the risk. That's the quantitative analysis. You're going to take the costs that really are associated with that event happening. Our database is breached. Our information is destroyed, encrypted by malware. Our website is taken offline. Whether it's denial of service or whatever, almost doesn't matter, right? We're looking at those events and the risk that they could happen. Our website could be hacked and defaced, denial of service offline. So what happens if that goes down? Well, we have that direct cost of, so much money it's going to cost us, but we have the cost of remediating that problem, throwing extra people at it, bringing up a backup server, throwing a bunch of overtime, maybe having to buy another equipment, another license, whatever it is. Those need to be put into that analysis. So, okay, we lose $200,000 an hour and it's going to take us $20,000 in cost to try to get back up. So we have to do, that's, the core of what we do with access management. We're going to give people access. We joked all the way back, and it does happen. Small company starts up, a few people in the classic proverbial garage, hook a few computers together. They're working on their business, their website, their idea, their whatever it is, their new business model, paradigm shifting, new business plan. And initially there's 3 people, and Alice, Bob, and Eve, they all have admin access. They all control their own computer. They're sharing freely with each other. And as maybe another person's added, initially they're just given pretty much full access. But at some point, ideally, you want to break that up. You don't want to continue to give everybody access, because if every person at every level of the organization has full administrative access, from a convenience point of view, that's very convenient, right? But from a security point of view, that's very bad. That inverse relationship. We've made it too convenient for people. People have access to not least privilege, but everything by default. And so if one person gets that crypto virus, it runs wild through the whole network, and they have access to everything. They can see everything. So the virus running in their name can encrypt everything. So we don't want to do that. We want to use risk management and decide, okay, well, at this level of employee or this role of employee, they need access to these things. And, if we have any grayness there, accounting person is going to have access to some accounting data. But whether you give them the whole accounting package or just the accounts payable or the accounts receivable side, kind of depends on your company's risk assessment. How risky is it to give people access to that data? What kind of data is going on there? Is it super secret source code in that part of the company? Is it, lots of, very high-end customers in your database that would be, very valuable if their information and credit cards were stolen? Your own internal information, payroll rates, what is it you're trying to protect, right? So we go through this risk assessment process. The lesson goes on to, make sure I read my little notes here, and talks about, some of the reasons that we would, for example, we want to put some of those in is, we know that there are attacks out there. If we give everybody in a company full access, well, we know that the odds are, even with the best people we could possibly hire, that somebody may fall victim to a social engineering attack, a phishing email, or a fake phone call, or the person who comes in and pretends to be an IT tech, whatever. And so, since we know that's a real threat and could happen to one of our employees, one of our temp employees, some employee in the future, since we have to be aware of that possibility, then that helps to illustrate why we wouldn't want to give full access and why we need to go through the risk management process to decide what level of access we're going to grant, and then set that up in our system so that we feel like we've laid down the security there. And once again, using the least privilege principle, we're giving everybody enough access to do their job, but not access to everything. And of course, there's all of these kinds of attacks, like privilege escalation things. Once somebody gets on, and it makes it really easy for the hacker. They don't even have to do the privilege escalation step if they hack into an account, and once they're on that account, they realize, oh, everybody has admin. Well, then their job's done. I mean, they're admin now. They can go anywhere. They don't have to privilege escalate. So the reason that there is a need is because, generally speaking, we're not going to give everybody access. That much access. And the idea is that, yes, okay, Sally's accounting got compromised, but because she was only given a limited amount of access, then that minimizes the damage and the risk to our organization that breach would, say, take us down, or cause us lots of fines, or take us offline for a period of time, etc., because it's going to be not possible, at least initially, for the attacker to be able to use Sally's account to do much more than the area they're in. Now, they may try, of course, then to do privilege escalation or move laterally within your network. But once again, if you've done this correctly and you've laid down these more minimum levels of access, and you've set up your access controls to, with guided by a solid risk assessment process, then hopefully you'll minimize the chances that will become a major breach and event. Now, of course, the countermeasures that we have when we look at the risk assessment, one, of course, is deciding what level. That's a countermeasure. If we don't give everybody access to everything, then that's a valid thing. But there are other things, obviously, like security awareness training to prevent people from falling for various and sundry tricks. There are all kinds of both people and technology solutions, training your people, hiring additional people, putting technology in place, putting policies in place, right? And of course, there's even a reference, again, kind of a review at the end of this lesson on the 7 domains of IT infrastructure, because as we said back when we introduced that in some of the early classes, the 7 domains of the typical IT infrastructure are a conceptual model that allow us to take a whole enterprise corporate network and break it into different pieces so we can look at what we need to do. And if you think of that model, you have the users as one of those domains, right? They're kind of the unique beast. There's no equipment, it's the people. But then you have the other domains like LAN and WAN and workstation and remote access and the server area, etc. All of those areas need a degree of access control. You need to have a login to your workstations. Every user needs to have a unique login, particularly if you're dealing with, if they're accounting, right, when we're dealing with PCI DSS for compliance, and not just for PCI, but generally most corporations have a unique login for everybody, so we can track and audit what's going on, who's doing what things, when you logged into your computer. Maybe from a work hour point of view, what kinds of applications and things you used within the system, and all of that is set by your access control, your rights and permissions that are given in the system. And so we, of course, need access controls at the workstation level. We need them at the LAN networking level. Now, in many cases, in today's world, we have the concept of single sign-on. In many cases, you will log in once, whether that be internal to a corporate server internal to the network, or even using some kind of cloud service provider. And you basically log in one time, your single sign-on, and instead of then having to log into the mail server and having to log into the accounting server and log into a database server, instead that one login carries with it all of your rights and permissions. So when you try to log into another machine, you basically are kind of carrying a token around, depending upon which of the tools. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the specific text next week. Well, in a little bit in the next chapter, actually, for that matter. But so, we're going to have access controls apply all the way through, and not just digital access controls. If we're talking server rooms and router and switch closets and things like that. We need physical security and controls there too. Who has access to those, right? We don't need just anybody to be able to open up that door, plug something in, and start causing trouble, right? So we have to think through all of those controls. Access controls actually include like access to the building, access to a particular wing, access to a secure area. It's not all about the login, though that is a hugely important piece of access control. Physical security access controls come into play too, especially as we look at the different domains in question. So the last lesson we're going to cover today as we wrap up, moving pretty quick, but I thought a couple people might show today, but this will be a recorded session. That's fine. Number of folks in the class this time around. But lesson 7 is on access control systems. And there's kind of two things that are going on in this lesson. One is initially some conceptual types of control systems. You're going to see a lot of ACs, basically, access controls. And so you're going to see in this lesson these different models from RBAC and DAC and SACL and DCL, ACL. So what are all these abbreviations and what do they mean? Well, ACL in this context and in the broadest context of access controls is access control list. So anytime there is, and this doesn't have to be a list like on paper, it could be a list at the front desk. Only people on this list can come in this area, right? So that's an access control list. When you have firewall rules that are blocking traffic or allowing traffic, technically those are access control lists. When you have lists of users and groups and permissions and rights, so when somebody logs in, they only get certain permissions and rights on your network against your servers and printers and data stores. That's an access control list, okay? So we're going to see the term access control list a whole lot, and what you're going to see in this lesson is that there are a number of different authentication or authorization models that sort of underlie different access control systems, access control list. So SACL is a system access control, and then DACL is discretionary access control, and then you have role-based access control, WBACL. So what are these? Well, let's just start with the easiest one. If you at home, your roommate, your friend, your significant other, your wife, spouse, whatever, you have a couple computers, you've got them on, plugged into your device, your router / switch that came from your, say, cable provider. And so you're on basically this little network segment with your couple machines, and you want to be able to share computers, share files across, right? You can do that in just out-of-the-box Windows kind of things. And so you as the owner and user and technically admin of your laptop or your desktop can say right-click on a folder and say share and go through some choices and pick who you want to share it with, everyone, just a particular user. Do you want to give read-write access or just read? All the stuff we're talking about. It's an access control. You're setting up access controls for files on your machine, and that is at your discretion. So that's what we mean by discretionary access control list or discretionary access control policy. That's sort of the peer-to-peer, out-of-the-box model. You can take a couple Macs, put them on the same network, and they can share with each other. And for that matter, Macs and Windows can share, because Macs out of the box generally support SMB or Samba behind the scenes, so they can talk on the Windows level. They have their own protocol, and of course we could have a couple machines, and as long as we have IP addresses, well, we could theoretically set up web servers, FTP servers, anything. And once again, all at our discretion. So as the users, like my wife and I, we have a just that kind of a network here. Lots of devices on it, multiple desktops, laptops, and of course IoT devices. But we want to be able to share, and we work on certain projects together. And so we have a common place where we've shared basically an external drive out to both of us, so we control that. So it's within our realm. It's our discretion. And but when you go to the enterprise world, we don't want that. We don't want everybody just to be able to go, oh, I can share whatever. Instead, you control that with access. And so you get into a situation of either having mandatory access controls, where the admins and the top-down approach. You can have role-based. That's a very common model, where the access controls are granted based on your role. So that accounting example, once again, comes to, we can put people in the overall accounting group, and that gives them general access to accounting shares and the accounting software. But then we might have subgroups in their additional roles, like, okay, if your accounts payable, you can only see this part of the accounting software. You can't get into the other records. If you're in accounts receivable, then yes, you can get into these records, but you can't go off and create bills, against, pay bills from our vendors. So role-based, access controls. So the first part of this lesson is all about just defining these. And once again, sorry, and acronyms in our field are everywhere, right? But talking about discretionary access control, mandatory access control, role-based access control, system-based access control, on and on. You'll need to just know what these are. You might see them like on Security Plus exam or something. And then we talk a little bit at the end about some of the ways that could be done. There's a little bit of talk about Kerberos, which is an enterprise authorization and triple identity authorization and access control. And then there's even some discussion about network access controls, about layer 2 and 3. Now it's the OSI model we're talking about when we go back to that, right? What kind of controls that we can put in place there. And then a little discussion about what I talked about, the idea, which is very common these days in one form or another, the single sign-on SSO. And so that's kind of where we wrap up today. Looks like we're doing fine on time. And so what we're going to come back to for next week, for our last workshop next week, which I have also gone ahead and posted, will be on Wednesday again, same time. So we're doing them Wednesdays this time. We're going to talk about, we had introduced last week at the end the concept of the 3 states of data. And so we are going to talk a little bit more about securing the 3 states of data next week. We are going to talk about how to actually, put in place some of the access controls, implementing access controls, and then we're going to come back and kind of wrap up. We'll close back out. It's all tied together, but we're going to finish up with a little bit return to the cryptography side of things as we get to lesson 10 on PKI, which stands for public key infrastructure. I think you all get now, you've done it yourself, you do it online with the banks and whatnot, that rough, large, high level idea of how that public-private key system works. And you're even going to get to do the sort of proof of concept mathematical exercise, which will give you some, I hope, insight and comfort in understanding, at least high level, how the mathematics behind that work. But what this lesson really talks about is, what are the other pieces involved in that? So like, when we go to a bank and the bank provides us their key and we're doing that exchange, one of the things that happens is it's not just that simple. It's we get a key that's been signed itself with public-private keys. And that allows us to then check with that third party, like Network Solutions, GoDaddy, whoever the registrar was, whoever sold the SSL certificate, whoever did the issuing of that secure certificate, they've signed it themselves with their own key. And what this does is in the background, your browser says, okay, hey, Amazon, hey, bank, let's talk. Let's change keys. And then for a quick second, your browser says, okay, I got that person's key. Hey, over here, is that really who I think it is? Is that really my bank? Is that really Amazon? Can you validate that? Can you do your math and say, yes, that's the key I signed. That's at the right IP. That's the right company, the right server. Yes, I know that is who you think it is. It's your bank. And then you can complete the transaction. So there's these other pieces, that key authority, that authority we can go off and check with, right? Certification authority. So we're going to talk about some of the infrastructure pieces that are needed, because if you're going to implement public-private key encryption within your, say, enterprise environment, then you have to have that whole infrastructure. You have to be able to issue keys, revoke keys, manage keys, validate keys, have a key server, have a certificate authority to validate these things. So we'll talk about those and a little bit about the specs and protocols that go with it. And then that will wrap up our cryptography and access management class. All right. Well, that's all we have for today. Lessons 4 through 7. The middle 4 knocked out, leaving us the last 3 for next week. As usual, it takes a little while to download, upload, and get everything processed, but I'll stick this video in the announcement section later. And then later this afternoon, I have some one-on-ones with a few of you. Had a bunch with some of you yesterday, and so we'll see you then. Thanks. Bye.